Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everybody. Today on the show, we have Anke Richter. She is an international journalist and author based in Christchurch, New Zealand. Before immigrating there with her family in 2003, she was a magazine writer, TV producer, and business reporter in Germany. Anke has covered everything from the 2011 Christchurch earthquake to the 2019 mosque attack and has traveled widely in the South Pacific reporting on climate change and social issues. Over the last few years, she has been focusing her research on cults, which has resulted in her latest book, Cult Trip: Inside the World of Coercion and Control. It's an intense, riveting, and personal investigation into the world of cults and the minds of their leaders. You can find more about Anke and her work at ankerichter.net. Here's Anke now. I cannot tell you how excited I am to be speaking with Anke Richter today, because I have loved really being able to speak with you over, cyberspace, right? The internet. And we haven't really had a chance to have this kind of face-to-face moment in a way that I would really like to catch up to see how life has been. I mean, you've been up to so many things, so many really, really powerful things, and a book and a conference. And so take a moment, if you can, to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into all the things you've been up to.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. It's fantastic to finally be talking to you, because you were, I guess, the first expert out there in the cultiverse who I sent my manuscript to before it was published and asked you to have a read over it and, tell me if you like it. And it sounded like you did. And that felt really, really good and really supportive. And yeah, I'm a cult journalist. I'm actually a journalist per se. I've been a journalist for 30 years. I live in New Zealand, originally from Germany. I worked as a foreign correspondent for the German media from here in New Zealand, but also for local media. I've written 4 books, and my last book is about cults, and it's called Cult Trip: Inside the World of Coercion and Control. It's coming out in May in the US, which is very exciting. And yeah, it follows my my investigative research into a couple of cults here in New Zealand and around the world, and how I came to close as a journalist, and also how I dabbled in some spiritual stuff myself that opened my eyes. And I'm now also the convener of the first cult conference here in New Zealand called Decult, and that's happening in October. So I'm really excited to talk to you about that too.
Yes, absolutely. We can most certainly talk about that. And I think to be able to say too, I have a lot of people I consult with in New Zealand, in Australia, in that part of the world where there haven't been enough resources. I mean, truth be told, there really aren't enough resources anywhere, even here in the States. So it has really been incredible to see how much people have really needed to connect, to get some healing, and also have been really frustrated by the lack of governmental support and oversight. And I know someone who was raised in a cult in New Zealand that no one knew about, because it was in some very kind of wooded area, and no one even knew there was a house there and barbed wire around it. I mean, it was like this, you could hide. You could hide in a lot of different places. And that's why cults can exist and can continue to exist in some places where people just don't have eyes on what's happening. And I'm sure you have found that in your part of the world.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened, Rachel, because I thought I'd seen and heard it all after researching the aftermath of this terrible sex cult that we had here in New Zealand called Centrepoint Sex and Therapy Cult. And that folded about 20 years ago. And I went out to research the aftermath of it. And then also researched another cult that's still going strongly here, Gloriaville, and a few others in between, like Karma Yoga. What I didn't expect after my book came out about a year ago here in New Zealand how many people come out of the woodwork and contact me as the to-go-to person for their trauma, for their healing, for, like you said, cults that I hadn't even heard about, the house with the barbed wire, or now I'm curious, which one is that? But I didn't even know until a few months ago what the 2x2s were, the Christadelphians or the 12 tribes, and they're all active here too. And then to have people reach out to me, especially those who were born and raised in those groups, and they suddenly see me as someone who understands them, because I've written a book where I primarily talk to former children from cults. And I've really deep dive into their trauma and into how lost they were on the outside. So I guess that must have resonated with a few others who've read the book here. And then they come to me, and I'm only a journalist. I'm not a therapist like you. I'm not a cult expert. I have, no expertise in how to handle people's trauma, how to talk to them. And I'm also not running in some kind of agency or so, which we desperately need here in New Zealand. So this is how the whole idea was born, maybe a bit too fast after my book came out, because I could have needed a breather, I think. It became so obvious that we need to do something here. And the most obvious idea was, well, let's just run a conference here, a bit in the same style as ICSA does at International Celtic Studies Association. Bring a lot of good people here, local authors, activists, victim support groups. We have a few of those, but we don't really have the experts. They're all overseas. And whenever people have asked me in those last months and years, who could help me, or who could I consult, especially for therapy or so, I've always sent them your way and other ways, but always to people who are overseas and not here in New Zealand. We don't have trained cult counselors. We don't have cult recovery therapy here. And so we're also introducing that for the very first time through the conference. So yeah, New Zealand desperately needs some of these resources that are already in other countries. And like you said, they are too short everywhere, but we don't have any of them here, apart from 2 small groups that are fantastic, and they're doing on-the-ground work for people who have come out of Christian cults, but not so much for others.
Right. Oh, yeah. It's so imperative. I know I was involved with the Pacific Rim conference, with the cult conference, and what I was hoping was that it would. I mean, it really was wonderful, and I was happy to speak at it. You want it to be that there is this momentum that comes from it, and then suddenly, in this magical way, there will be all these resources and people who understand, and attorneys who can help people, and law enforcement that cares. And that becomes, it's like pushing a boulder uphill. That you just, you have to make that happen. And so this conference, this Decult conference, is so incredibly exciting and so necessary that it's continuing the momentum, which is really needed.
I hope it's not just a drop in the ocean. I don't think so. I think the momentum is really building here. And if there's one thing I can proudly say I'm good at, it's networking. And also with my 30 years of journalism behind me, I know what a good story is. I know what the media is interested in. To sort of be a media liaison for this whole topic, but without having to do the heavy lifting of the actual research anymore, because that impacted on me, as you would know if you read culture. But to actually now be more active behind the scenes and bring those people together who can hopefully bring some change here in New Zealand, and actually instigate something, and have the right people in a room together talking to each other, and get them all fired up, and have them listen to some cult survivors without just regurgitating trauma porn. That's not what we want to do. It's quite educational, but at the same time, it's going to be a really well crafted event where people actually come away from thinking, wow, this is important. This is not what I thought what cults are like, or what cult leaders are like, or what they need. And then, this would be so amazing to actually introduce cult recovery therapy to New Zealand, and then bring someone also like Janja Lalic over here who can talk to some government agencies, to some departments, and basically give them cult education. The judiciary needs it. The police needs it. It's so needed. It's needed around the world, but it's especially needed here. And, the time is right, because we have this, we have a lot of cults here in New Zealand, but one that's really in the public eye right now, again, is Gloria Vale, this very fundamentalist Christian enclave on the West Coast here. Fantastic documentary has just come out here on our local broadcaster, TVMZ. And a lot of people are shocked about what they're seeing. To me, it's not such a surprised because I've been, researching it and talking about it. And it's now like, well, welcome to my world. Now you get it? Okay. The power of good media, right? Now you know why this is not okay. Why is no one doing something about it? So we're using that momentum where people are contacting me as well saying, have you watched this doco? Of course I've watched this doco. I've been, liaising with them or whatnot. Have you watched this doco? What can we do about it? And then I kind of say, look, this is why we're having this conference. We need this. So I'm a bit of an activist in that space, but doing it in a professional way. And I really hope it works. And I'm excited. And Decult will be live streamed, so anyone can watch it from around the world.
That's wonderful. Right. I'll speak with you, offline, so to speak, about a lot of the groups that I've been hearing about in that area, because I think they really do need to be having, eyes on them. But I've also noticed that when people are trying to, or they get the courage to try to get law enforcement involved, it seems to me and to other people who hear the stories that, of course, it's so egregious. And yes, that cult is going down. Like, there's no way they're going to live through this. And then they do, because they sort of are falling through the cracks, and there are these loopholes, and it becomes so devastating for the people who really want to pursue justice. And it just keeps being elusive. And the cult keeps getting, protected by these loopholes. And that feels like such a crime. That happens here in the States as well. I know I was involved in the show Unwell, where they actually address the Agama group in Thailand. It's another one of these situations where from the outside, it just, especially if you go on their website, it just seems like this lovely retreat.
Well, tell you what, I went back there last year, actually, because I did a book launch on Kopangan, which was a little bit edgy for me. The place where I had the book presentation with a great supporter there, Brian Gruber. He's a wonderful colleague and advocate against some of the toxic spirituality there and conspiracy theorists and so on. And we had this event, and it was literally just down the road from Agama. And I had a look there the next day, and it looked very run down, looked very poorly kept. But then things have really ramped up online from what I heard. And especially with COVID, it gave them a chance to put out courses again. And people forget, people don't Google. What happened in 2018 is a long time ago for many people. And then if they're already in the mindset that the media can't be trusted, especially the mainstream media, if they're already in a sort of alternative media space, a convincing headline and people coming back and gushing, saying, it was so beautiful and I got my, this and that there. Then the Guardian expose or my expose here for the New Zealand Herald and big media outlet that 200,000, people read in 1 week, and 50 other countries around the world reporting about Agama yoga doesn't really, unfortunately, sadly, doesn't really put a massive dent in their business, or at least not big enough that it can be shut down. And, it's so frustrating. I think this is also why I'm so motivated to help activists, because I see it again and again, how they throw themselves in there and then they burn out. And then often there's also infighting and there are different factions. And it's so sad to see how much emotional labor is done by people who've already been hurt by a cult, and who shouldn't be the ones doing this. It should be the judiciary. It should be the courts and the lawyers and the media. They should take over the baton and do their job. And as you also know, it's really tricky because there are legal loopholes. Cults are not illegal. I don't know any country where running a cult is an illegal business. You got to get them on something else, right? And it's difficult. And then also the ignorance here ignorance, maybe it's a harsh word, but the media and I think it's fair for me to say this as a journalist. Media in general they've come a long way to understand cults better, but it hasn't helped over the years. There's this sort of sneer and disrespect towards people who are spiritual seekers, who are caught up in groups like that. There's so many misconceptions and cliches, and that hasn't helped either. Because if there's this understanding, it's kind of their own fault, and only if it's really really horrific and something really terrible happens, and there is another wacko or another journalist. I mean, let's hope there never will be, but something on that scale, then there's a rape case in court, and it takes a lot for it to even get there. Then someone will report. And that's really sad too. And on the other hand, I also know, just watching some of the stories up closely that have lately unfolded here in New Zealand, some Me Too stories, I also know how hard it is for some media outlets to get these things over the line. If they're not totally lawyered up, and media anywhere in the world, I guess, is struggling, right? Then they just can't risk to be sued by some litigious company or organization. So they've got to be super careful how they word things. And if it's not clear cut, and often it's not, I mean, for you and me, maybe it's clear cut what coercion looks like or what grooming looks like. But in a legal sense, when it's adults, it's not so easy just to slap that label of cult leader, predator, abusive guru on someone, right? So this is the stuff we're dealing with.
Right, exactly. It's invisible to a great degree, right? And so with the legal system, of course, they go right to, well, can you prove it? Is there proof? Well, we need to define that in a different way, and you need to be able to look at some of the nuanced things. I know that, it's a sad statement, but there have been a number of people I've worked with who said that they wish they had been physically abused if they had a choice, right? Because then they would have marks. Then they could say, look what happened to me. And it's a sad situation when someone says they wish, right, that they had been physically abused, but then they would be believed. And so when something is just happening to someone's mind, I think people really can discard it and all too quickly blame the victim.
Yes, there's so much education that needs to be done, and I think I want to be part of that. That's where I see my role right now, and whether that is in a journalistic role or with a conference, but let's just call it cult education, and it's needed. And if you think of how little maybe schools and teachers and the healthcare knew about, let's say, the needs of trans people, or to even recognize the signs of sexual abuse in children 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now, that's luckily changed, right? We don't tend to blame women anymore who are in a domestic violence situation. We tend to understand what it takes for them to leave and how all this plays out with the love bombing and the dependency and what it does to your mind and your we understand these dynamics now, but then they're not getting applied to people being in a coercive group, and that's just as abusive, and that you can't just turn around and blame the victim and say, well, you're just stupid because you joined a cult. And I would never do that. I would see straight away that this doesn't work and that they're doing this and this and this. Yeah. It's surprising how many people, often after my book talks as well, that I've been giving at festivals over the last years, how often, I have to say, often men come up to me afterwards and then they say, oh, yeah, it's fascinating. And then I call it cult splain to me. I'm not sure if you get that sometimes, but probably not, because you're such a renowned expert. But I get a lot of cult splaining. And then often by men who say, well, it's so obvious. And they're insinuating they're clearly too intelligent to be ever caught up in something like that. But it's fascinating to watch others. And I think, yeah, dude, you'd be the first one who wouldn't notice.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Right. And as though it has anything to do with intelligence, what also seems to happen is that parents are blamed. Oh, well, I would have raised my children in a way where, they would not have been, there's all this posturing. And for some reason, people need to give their opinion and also be superior in that moment, as though you asked their opinion. But people give it anyway. I mean, I know as a mom of actually trans kids, that just having people say, well, I don't know how I feel about that. Well, I don't care. Why would I care how you feel about that? Why does it have anything to do with you? What? I don't find it problematic at all. So happy it's available that they can become who they're supposed to be. End of story, But yeah, people like to share this in that kind of superior way, which I'm sure is really frustrating for former members who then get shamed, right? And then they don't want to tell their story. And parents also, it's just equally isolating, I think, for them, because they get judged as parents.
And then just to come back to the cliches and the mocking and the shaming, Gloria Bell, which I've just mentioned before here in New Zealand. Did you know that The Handmaid's Tale, the TV series, the Hulu series back then, their costumes were actually based on the real Glorivale here in New Zealand. This is how close it comes. So it's our own homemade Handmaid's Tale. And Glorivale, for the last 10 years or so, was just a joke in the public eye because we had a very fluffy, sugar-coated document. I mean, I'm putting air quotes around documentary, a flockumentary here in New Zealand that was, I think it's fair to say, was actually a piece of cult propaganda, and where the filmmakers worked very closely with Glorivale, and apparently it looks like they had them sign off on it. It could be legally tricky for me to state it like that, but I'm just doing it anyway. Just it looks like it did. It like they did, right? And Glorivale was just a joke, and people like to mock it. And these names to have, like, hope something disciple, faithful disciple, or precious something, or and these weird blue frocks, and they're the shiny happy people in this commune on the West Coast that were looked at like a zoo, and you could come and visit them and go to their concerts every 2 years and basically be a voyeur. And that's been so accepted. It's actually shocking. And I'm going to have to say, I did the same for a little bit. I once went to a Halloween party with a group of friends back in the days, and they said, oh, let's all dress up as people from Glorivale. And we had these costumes and these ridiculous names and wooden spoons and Bibles in our little baskets. And I cringe now, right? I mean, yeah, sometimes you have to have a sense of humor for sure. But the overall perception was always, this is just a joke. And, it's led to no one really caring as much as they should. Where were the women's groups picketing, protesting outside the compound? Where were the human rights people actually speaking up about this, saying this is not okay? We're one of the most egalitarian countries in the world. The last government was run by fantastic Jacinda Ardern, a feminist icon, and we're accepting, tolerating, somehow giving them charitable status. This gulag that's exploiting people, that's has a rape culture where kids are being sexually abused and women are so subjugated as just breeding and whatnot machines. Yeah, so that's. And again, this is why a cliche, a misconception about cult leaders or cult people in cults, it has consequences. It leads to not doing enough, of letting more children being harmed in a place where maybe earlier action, more people speaking up in Parliament, more activism from the right side also, and I have to look at my feminist sisters here in New Zealand, could have actually made a difference for a lot of children, a lot of youngsters who were suffering, who went into depression, into suicidal ideation. You name it. It's not a joke. Yeah.
No, not at all. I gave a talk recently at a conference about why fear makes people say yes when they really needed to say no, or they knew they needed to say no, which also has this under it, this sort of rubric of why people stay in situations, and that there are many really valid reasons, usually having to do with fear and control and manipulation. But that becomes the question posed to the victim. Why did you stay? If it was so bad, right? Like somehow you were accepting it. Somehow maybe you're exaggerating how bad it was because you stayed. And that's why I wanted to do that talk, because and as I'm writing all these reasons that I remember hearing from clients, that I was up to 40, and I realized I need to actually cap it at this point because my talk is going to go on for 9 hours. There's so many reasons that people stay. And really the point, and this is what I said at the end of the talk, is this is the wrong question.
It is the wrong question. And also, how do you even ask that question to someone who has never been outside, born and raised, second, third generation Glorivale again? Most people in there these days, most members are kids, yeah, because they multiply. No one really joins anymore from the outside. I mean, that was decades ago when people joined Glorivale and thought it was this utopian dream. So how do you even just leave something if you don't know the outside world? If you're caught up in the matrix, how do you even make that step? So to tell someone, well, just leave. We know it's better out here. Why don't you know? Well. Not if you're in an invisible prison and this is your whole life, and you have no means of even understanding really what the outside world is, and you've been indoctrinated against it, that it's run by the devil and you're going to suffer and no one's going to be kind there, no one's going to help you. And I mean, what is also true, you don't have any resources when you leave. You don't have an income. You don't have any money because you've been exploited all your life without you've been working since you were a child, slave labor. It's just been proven here in court in New Zealand last year. And you don't have access to a bank account or anything. You don't know how to drive a car or get money out of a cash machine or buy some normal clothes or all of that. So just leave. It's just not an option.
Right, right. And I think also people don't want to be 30, 40, 50 and older and not know how to do things that other people know. Who do they ask? And they're going into a supermarket, never having been in one before, and they don't know what to do. And if any of it, right? And so can you ask? I mean, there are a lot of therapy questions that I get asked, which is like, what happens if you're in a line at a supermarket and someone says, "Oh, I only have one thing. Can I go ahead of you?" Are you allowed to do that? Are you not? Even just down to that detail. Are you allowed to say no to anyone ever? That's a big one.
Wow, you get asked that in therapy. I mean, yeah. Oh, that's how deep it goes. This is how it can throw someone just being in the supermarket checkout, not knowing how to handle that situation because, oh, wow, it says so much.
It was really interesting. I mean, I've had people who have been involved in cults, some of whom were born and raised, some who had degrees before and then wound up in a cult and found themselves stupefied by standing in front of their washer and dryer, being afraid of making a mistake and being sure that someone was watching and would know that they had made a mistake and what would happen if they did. What did that mean about them? And then they would catch themselves thinking, oh no, how am I going to handle the bigger decisions in my life when I don't trust myself in the slightest? And I'm going to see myself as really a failure forever, even if I make the tiniest mistake. So I think people don't realize how debilitating the whole process is, It's incredible. All the more reason to have a conference, to have resources, to do everything that is really.
It's just a starting point. I don't think we can. I mean, I could run a 3 or 4 day conference with all the speakers and the interest I have, and it's really set in a way that we have to cut back sessions to 30 minutes for people who have a whole life story and so much to share, and they have to focus on just a few points. There's so much. People are just burning to finally speak and be seen and heard. But I think it's good to just we've got to. It's got to be an entry level as well of understanding the basics of how does recruitment work, what do people need who come out. And then later on, next couple of years, and Rachel, I hope you can make it to New Zealand. We can do more. We can have more specialized seminars and so on. We can bring more people over, and then we can maybe focus on, hone in onto some of these bigger topics. But let's just start with actually giving people who really need to know, who are frontline services and doctors, healthcare, therapists, let's give them a basic understanding of what people need and also how to spot it when someone presents at hospital. My husband's a doctor, and you'd be surprised how many of his colleagues are just not aware that people in cults end up in hospital, and maybe could be a turning point where suddenly they realize, even though they have a broken leg or something, oh, now all the pressure is gone. I'm actually in an environment and people just care for me and I don't have to do anything for them. And this is what it should feel like. Or they present, to doctors something and there's so much mistrust because they don't trust the health system and their medical needs have been neglected. And then for a doctor or a nurse or so to actually have a sense of what the backstory to that could be. And then maybe they have a way to introduce, just open that door a little bit and start a conversation that might be a game changer for that person. So there are a lot of people in critical positions around the world, especially here in New Zealand, who we basically just want to say, hey, you can play a real part here in someone coming out of a cult. You can make a difference. So just be aware of what you need to know.
The story about someone winding up in the hospital, having a broken anything, or needing to be tended to, just being tended to. A story that I told a while back on the podcast briefly, but I just want to revisit it for a moment because it's precisely what you're talking about. I was doing an intervention and we're in a room with a family with a woman who had devoted her life to a guru who had been abusive to her. And she was really afraid of leaving. She really saw her place there, that's what her life was supposed to be like. Her family was very concerned about her. And I remember I came prepared. I had studied all of out as much as I could get my hands on, the cult leader, other people who had left, brought books, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing was making an impact, at least not that we could tell, because you never know what's happening under, right, like sort of behind the scenes in someone's psyche that they're just not quite ready to let on about. But so from all appearances, it didn't seem like that we were making an impact. So we take a break. And I go to another side of the room. We were in a conference room at a hotel. It was a bit impersonal, unfortunately, but they had a little bit of a tea service. So I said, I'm going to go get some tea. And I asked her, I said, I know there are a lot of chairs in this room. It's probably hard for you to get over there. What kind of tea would you like? And she just stopped, like dead in her tracks. And it's the first time I saw her have any emotion. And she said, What did you say? And I said, What kind of tea? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you not want tea? But if you do, I'm over here and you're going to have to climb over your chairs to get her. What kind of tea would you like? And what do you like in it? And she just burst out crying. And it was like, I'm crying thinking about it. She said in the last, 18 years that she had been in this group, no one had taken care of her. When she was giving birth, no one tended to her. She was to do for everyone else. She had never been asked, what do you need? What would you like? And down to the specificity of what do you take in your tea? Forget it. Just, it was her job to get up at 4 a.m. and brew the tea for everyone else. And so I'm there with my books, right? None of that mattered. It was sort of the human connection, the being cared for, that she realized how much she had not had that, how much she actually really needed it and missed it. And it was just a chance kind of offer. And it turned things around, which was really interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And also thinking of the ones that, the people I've interviewed who come out of Glorabell, and for some of them it was quite recent. I've heard similar things. I also had to sometimes get used to the different ways of sort of operating around me or in the world, or a certain awkwardness. And I'm looking back at 10 years now of on and off meeting people, interviewing people now, and now collaborating with people. Some of them are on our team for the conference who've come out of groups. And it's such a spectrum, right? Depending on how long ago it was, whether someone was raised there, how long they've had since they've come out, what kind of recovery they've had. Big difference there between this former sex and therapy cult Centrepoint here in New Zealand, which was, such a big part of my work, where there wasn't anything really on offer after everything folded. There were court cases. People went to jail. Their leader went to jail, and some other people for sexual abuse of children and manufacturing of drugs. And there was lots of media, but in the very focused on the terrible stuff that happened, not so much on how are the people doing who were in there, where are they now, who's helping them, how do they get back into normal life, how do these families heal, where you have victims and perpetrators in one family. And so there was nothing there for that really, and it's only started a few years ago, actually kickstarted by some of the journalism I did back then before my book came out. And now we have the Centrepoint Restoration Project run by a fantastic medical doctor here in New Zealand, Caroline Ensley, who is also, who will be a speaker at the conference and is a close collaborator, and who's very passionate also about the medical care for cult leavers, which I mentioned before. But she started this project also to start some kind of restoration in terms of restorative justice, or is it possible to get an apology from the first generation to the second generation? There's just so much missing. And to look at these different groups of leavers, the former Centrepoint children and adults from 20 odd years ago, the Glorabell leavers from the last 10 years or so, or last couple of years, and still coming out. And then everything in between, what a difference it makes if people like the ones now from Glorabell, where there's actually an organization on the ground, the Glorabell Leavers Support Trust, all power to them, who are there specifically to help them resettle, to get them the right therapy as well, who they're really, really well educated and they're doing a great job. And what a difference that makes. And this shouldn't just be done by volunteers. This should be a service that should be funded by our government. It's like, drug counseling and sexual abuse counseling and other prevention of harm. So, I think I've been a good observer over the years without being an academic or so, but just by knowing so many people who've come out and who've told me their story, and to see what's needed, and what a difference it makes if the right people are around someone who lives in the right organizations and the right support.
Yes, it makes a huge difference. Really normalizes things. It helps people feel really cared for. It helps also, I think, undo this message that there's nothing out in the world for you, that those people don't really care about you and they don't love you, and your life will be, a miserable failure and terrible everything, fill in the blank. And people have said to me time and time again, people out here in the world are actually really nice. And I get to make mistakes and it's okay. And I get to forget to call someone back because I really just forgot to call someone back, and I'm not taken to task for it. People understand that you can just be human. I mean, just all of these things that really make a huge difference, again, in the little details, as well as the big things that really make an impact. And I'm wondering just about your experience, because it's very interesting to learn about how you got involved in this. And sometimes it is just this happenstance moment. But you also said that you were a searcher and open to some ideas too. So I'd love you to be able to talk about you in that way, and also what brought you into, and who brought you into being interested in pursuing these stories.
It was about 10 or so years ago. And I went to a festival in Australia. I was already a spiritual festival, a neo-tantra festival. And at the time, after the earthquakes here in New Zealand, and also maybe being middle-aged and being quite settled here in my life, but also being an immigrant, maybe missing a few things as well, I'm basically open for some kind of new adventure or something to come into my life. And had already met some people here in New Zealand and gone to some of these Tantra workshops. Very cynical in the beginning. Like, oh no, this is esoteric. This is not for me. I'm a journalist. I wouldn't be seen dead doing anything like this. But there was something that landed. And at this festival in Byron Bay, where something really landed, where I had this total aha moment, which I only realized afterwards, years later, when I actually wrote my book, I realized that is the moment when I got hooked. And I guess everyone has a moment like that. And it sounds very unspectacular. I wasn't looking into any guru's eyes. I wasn't there for the gurus. I was there ecstatic. I was in an ecstatic dance session at this festival. And I was just so free. I had there were no drugs. It was pure ecstasy from feeling alive and feeling seen, and flirtatious energy in the room. And oh my God, I was like a new person all of a sudden. Here I was jumping around and looking into other people's eyes, and then stepping outside on the balcony of the humid tropical Byron Bay evening, and put my hands out into the pouring rain. And I just thought, oh, I always want to feel like this. There's no going back. This is me. This is the real me, and there's no going back. And that sense of, this is a line that I've now crossed. This is a realization, a bit of an epiphany. I cannot ignore that anymore. There is something here for me. No matter how these people dress, or the new age they speak, or the stuff I'm really skeptical about, but something here is good for me, and I should pursue that. And it's going to be great for my life. And I think it was for a while, until I saw the other side, or I just became more and more aware of the other side of it and the price that you pay for that. So I did actually do a lot of courses at the time with ISTA, International School of Temple Arts. So that became my new hobby almost. I've traveled around the world. I've been a journalist for many years. I've done some big adventures. As a family, we lived in the South Pacific on an atoll as a doctor's family in a very, very remote place where you can only get to by boat from Samoa for 7 months. And, I've definitely had my share of adventures. So I wasn't looking for something on the outside so much. I thought, okay, this is my next adventure, is actually exploring who I am and how I can be, and how I can be with others. And I had also something that I now realize as a very culty moment or hook, that I went into some of these events and some of these, I wouldn't even call it parties, but workshops and ecstatic spaces and trainings. And within hours or days, I thought, wow, I have deeper connections here, heart to heart, than I have some of my best friends in New Zealand around me. And normal life started to feel a bit shallow. And I was I felt very superior in my new knowledge, and that I've seen the light and that I know what's really good. And I've sent a lot of people here in New Zealand, quite a few people into these courses as well, when I knew that they had some relationship problems or something, but I just thought, oh yeah, I've got something for you. I was quite evangelical. I can see all that now. Just to fast forward, I was never harmed in those spaces. I was definitely inappropriately approached. And at the time, I was probably flattered, thinking, ooh, one of the big dudes, they see me, they'll want me, and maybe there's something for me there. If only I was bold enough or whatever, to just do as the others do. Oh my God, maybe, there would be this, whatever, cosmic orgasm or whatever. Whatever they were, whatever the carrot was, that was, even though it wasn't outspoken, but it's kind of dangling there in front of my nose. And also watching others, especially the female facilitators, and most of them were lovers of the male facilitators and the heads of the school and so on, and to see how sexy and beautiful they were, and how essential and also powerful in their own way, in their own right. And they were just modeling something that I thought I would never be, or I was always a very, quite a masculine sort of kind of woman in lots of ways in my career and my approach. And then to suddenly get this whole new input around femininity and surrender, which I now question very much and see as quite toxic. And then years later, when I did all this research about Agama yoga in Thailand, that was a big aha moment, because it's almost like I saw the stuff that I had liked and embraced, and I thought was good for me. I suddenly saw this on steroids, and how awful it became if this is taken to the extreme. And that was a real eye opener for me in terms of my own, community, or the stuff that I was interested in, to actually think, wow, it's just going to end up like this in a few years if they don't understand where the pitfalls are, or where they've gone wrong, or where they've actually been wrong maybe from the start. And this is still a bit of a question I'm not quite, I don't have the definite answer yet. Has it always been set up for the sexual gratification of its founder and so on? Or has it just turned in a certain direction? So at the same time, when I was at this festival, I also met a woman there from this former sex and therapy cult here in New Zealand, Centrepoint. Well, not anymore. I mean, she was a teenager there. She had been a teenager there. When I met her, she was already in her 40s, like me. And we hit it off, and I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that she grew up in this place. I'd never heard about it. And then a few months later, the former guru leader, Bert Potter, of that community died, and Angie, the woman I'd met, was ready to tell me her story. And I had a book contract, and I launched into it, and it became 2 years of my life that took me into this dark labyrinth of unresolved trauma of the former kids and the former members of that group. And I had not seen that coming. I don't think I was naive. I just didn't really realize what cult trauma means and how big this was. And I got lost. So it affected me. I had to stop the book in the end. I was diagnosed with PTSD later from vicarious trauma. And it just gives you a bit of an idea of what I came up against. It was legally really, really difficult. One of the people who tried to stop my book was actually one of the victims of the cult, because she probably felt threatened, someone coming and maybe telling her story. Just gives you an idea how fraught this whole aftermath of this group Centrepoint here in New Zealand was and still is. I'm actually struggling to find a former child from Centrepoint to come and sit on a panel at DCALT at the conference on our Kids and Cults panel. It's actually really difficult to find someone who's not too damaged, to be honest, where it could be a mental health risk, or most of them just don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. They're not in a space where they can be really analytical about it or can be advocates. So it gives you an idea. This then giving up the book, but also meant I'd learned a lot. And I then launched into other culty journalism projects. I became a bit of a to-go-to person here in New Zealand, and then also Germany with some stuff to write about cults. And fast forward a few years later, HarperCollins approached me to write a book about cults, and I had this unfinished manuscript about Centrepoint, and I pulled it all together, and I did some more research, and Gloriabel was then a big topic. And here I am now as someone who came to close. I definitely came to close to all of this. But looking back and how hard it was, and I would have never thought that years later I would be here with you on your podcast talking about this, organizing a conference. So out of all this hard work, which I really couldn't handle well at the time, and I didn't have the right support, and it was awful at times, something good has come out of this and will come out of this. So I'm putting it to good use now.
Yeah. Oh, it's so well said. If people want to be able to have any kind of way of understanding just how traumatizing certain people's experiences are within a cult, I think by you just saying, when I was researching this and writing about it, I developed PTSD just by hearing the stories. And so that does paint a picture, doesn't it? And how it's hard to find people who want to come forward and talk. It was that way for many years with other groups like the Children of God and others where it was just awful.
And also the contradictions, that I didn't realize it would be I didn't see it coming that it would be such a hornet's nest, that there are so many contradicting stories that you listen to someone with compassion for half a day who's finally opening up, and you believe them every word they're saying, and you cry with them, and then you meet someone else. And they say, "Oh no, but that's actually not how it was." Or you meet these really nice and understanding former adults from the commune who are, always ask me, "So what's in it for you? Why are you doing this? Have you been sexually abused?" So they're very upfront, being very trained in the human potential style of interrogation and feedback. It's always turned on me. It's always something about you that makes you do that. It's not because something was wrong with Centrepoint. No, it's something must be wrong with me that I want to go there as a journalist. Anyway, and so some of these well-meaning adults who seem really interested in contributing to some kind of repair and investigation about their former commune, either then pulled back the interviews or got cold feet, or had a bit of maybe a shock moment later when they actually heard from me what I knew, what they didn't seem to know, some of the most horrific stories of sexual abuse of children there, where I heard, where I was told things that I think they should have at least known to some degree. And then also it turned out that some of these adults, then I heard this again from some of the victims, that they weren't as pure and innocent, and they were active bystanders or even worse. So to actually then find a way legally, morally, ethically, it was almost like my own moral compass was completely skewed at that time. When you spend so much time with people who are always questioning my motives, who are trying to explain who are explaining their worldview to me, and in order to understand where they were coming from and why they started this community in the first place, I had to really dive deep into some of the psychological narratives around the time. Some of even studies that are now very questionable around the time in the 70s and 80s about intergenerational sex. So does it actually harm children, and freeing children sexually? And there was a whole movement at the time, also in Germany, where I'm from, and some parts of that were certainly really, plausible and laudable. But with it came a whole barrage of very problematic views, and also maybe a kind of cover up for pedophilia and for abuse that I think we need to really separate from not shaming and blaming kids for having, for masturbating or for running around naked, and not shaming their bodies. There's got to be a balance to find. And with Centrepoint, I was so fascinated about all this too, because I thought, here I am now in my 40s, diving into these courses, going to these workshops, which are a lot about your sexual freedom, not just freedom, but more so much about really finding out who you are, really being authentic and holistic and how you express that. It really appealed to me. It sounded very wholesome and also very exciting. And I thought, well, how different is that? Is that any different from the people who went into Centrepoint 30 years earlier and wanted to live communally and wanted to do the same and have these workshops and work in themselves, but then maybe also have, some amazing sexual experiences with others. It's not something that I would straight away, write off as wrong. So I tried not to blame what was there or judge what their motives were in the first place. But it became so confusing for me, and it still is to some degree now. Looking at this movement that I was part of, how much is what's the good stuff? What's the bad stuff? What is really healing? What is just intoxicating? Where does the manipulation start? What of that is intentional? What is part of the system? What just happens because power goes unchecked and some people are so charismatic and everyone wants to be close to them? These dynamics, which I've wrote about and investigated as a journalist where they've played out in a much more horrific and destructive way, I've actually experienced them and lived them and observed them up close in a more benign and smaller, and maybe not such an obvious way. But then where does it start? Where does it end? Right? Those are still the big questions for me, Rachel.
Right. Those are really, really big questions and really important questions. And, one of the things that makes it confusing, and I think about something I was talking to Pat Ryan about, where he was saying, when people can be from the same cult group, each person has had their own experience there. And so it's not uniform really across the board ever. I think and that's the same and true in so many places where there is going to be a different kind of reporting. There are people who have different wiring, some who really can look at things without falling apart, without getting fragmented. Others who stay distant, sort of look at it with one eye closed still because they know they would feel wrong looking at it, or constitutionally they wouldn't be able to handle it. So their way of talking about it is going to be much lighter and kind of distant. Some also have had an experience within a cult group where they were at the mercy of certain people within their sphere when other people were not. And cults transform over time too, and are different sometimes in different locations. And so someone's experience, let's say in the 80s, is going to be different in the 90s and so on. And people also involved for different amounts of time. A lot of people, because they don't have the language of what happened to them, they don't know they were abused, let's say. They don't know that it was sexual abuse because they think they brought it on or deserved it or was being specially chosen or whatever else. Ugh. So they might, if they're asked if they were abused, they would say no, even though they were, because they think they weren't. And so it's all over. I think about if I ever talk to my siblings about something, like as we were raised by other parents, but we weren't. And so, we all have different eyes that we saw things through and different ages that we were when the same thing happened. So it's a different reflection. I think what's interesting, though, just in terms of reading your book, is that even with the kind of disparate stories, there's still a through line. There's still, even when you're talking about certain people's experiences in a particular cult, but I also noticed from the different groups that you talked about, as different as they were in some ways, there was this through line and overlap. And I would love you to talk about that. Just as you were talking about different cults, what did you notice you were sort of pinpointing again and again, in these different groups that turned out to be the same?
There's a few through lines. I think the most obvious one, but also maybe comes as a bit of a surprise, is sexuality and how it is, how it played and plays out in those three groups, the three main groups that I've, went into or researched: Agama Yoga in Thailand, and Glorified and Centerpoint, they all look quite different from the outside, but one common denominator is the massive role that sex and sexuality, or the distortion of it and the control of it, plays. And when we say control, people always think, in general, I guess suppression of it springs to mind. When you think controlling sexuality means you're not allowed to have sex with someone, or at all, which is also the case in many cults, right? Where it's only there for making kids, and procreation, or not even at all. But control also means amplifying it, putting pressure on people that they have to have it in a certain way and with as many people as possible. And they have to be available for it. Otherwise, something's actually wrong with them, or they need to work harder on themselves if they're not feeling that desire the whole time and they're not up to having that many lovers per week or month or whatever. That is also control. And that's also, I think, very damaging. And that's what happened at Centerpoint. And that's what certainly also happened at Agama. And then in the mix also was the real sexual transformation and spiritual transformation. This is when it gets really icky and tricky. It comes from having sex with the leader, the guru. And usually it's not even called that. It's Agama yoga. It was a quote unquote meditation session at Swami's house. Yeah. But you walked away afterwards and, it was sex and was meant to transform you. There was this aspect of transformation. So at Gloriavale, not so much like that, but in Gloriavale, the Christian cult here in New Zealand, a real emphasis on sexuality as well, and a grooming, not just of for predators of girls, but also a grooming of women in general, or a kind of brainwash from the start, from the get-go, from when they're little girls, that they're objects for their husbands and for other men, and they have to be available, sexually available for them whenever. And we're talking, hours or days after giving birth in some cases. I've heard this from people who know. And that's, again, it's a way of controlling people's sexuality, where the wedding night is so openly, or the marriage is so public. These youngsters who barely know each other, they're in their late teens, and then the spiritual leader barges into the honeymoon suite and hands them props or checks on this and that. I mean, so sex, even in a very conservative Christian, strictly monogamous community, where you'd be punished for even showing a slither of, of skin, when you're of your ankle or your knees or anything unthinkable. But then, again, there's such a focus on women's bodies and how they should be, and how they should be in the bedroom, and how to please their husbands and that. So the sexuality is a common thread. And I guess it's in a lot of cults actually, but especially in those three. So I could really sum those three groups up as, even though I don't like the word sex cults, it's more like sex abuse cults is probably the right word. Another thing that I figured out, or I've become more clearer, is these attempts of people to transform a cult from within. And you just mentioned that, Rachel, and I actually to ask you too, is that actually possible? Can cults really be transformed? But so I've noticed that in all of these groups, especially Centerpoint and Agama Yoga, there were always attempts of whistleblowers, of people who were really invested in this community, and they were there for all the good reasons, and they were good people, and they really cared, and they believed in all the ideals and the utopia and the great teachings and whatnot. And their kids had grown up there, or they'd spent years there as yoga teachers, and they didn't just tolerate abuse. When they became aware of it, they tried to do something from within. And I feel for those people, and none of them succeeded. And years and years have been, gone by in those communities, both Centerpoint and Agama Yoga. People tried again and again until they're left with mental health problems, from burned out, ostracized, kicked out, whatever, trying to change the group from within. With Gloriavale, I don't think that's even really possible. So there's more pressure from the outside, which is good. But yeah, what are your thoughts, Rachel, on is it possible to transform a cult from within? I'd love to know.
Right. So it's interesting with transformation, because you can transform into a healthier form or less so. And so it all depends on a few things. It depends on the leadership. If you have the same leader throughout, and it's transforming in a bad way, I'm thinking of people like Jim Jones, who, started out as a street preacher and then, became more and more ill psychiatrically, and also more drug addicted and paranoid. And then it became very dangerous, secluded and secretive group, stockpiling weapons and other things. So yeah, I think it's good. Like when I hear about a new cult group, I still want to kind of keep watch on it to see if it is changing over time. There's new leadership at times. And sometimes it creates more health in a group, or at least a little more freedom, depending on if the person in charge is a bit more healthy and has less ego need for absolute control and dominance, and is a little more open to, differing views and a little more open to having more eyes on what's happening. But I've seen that happen temporarily within a particular cult group. And then that person, I've seen actually twice, a person who was willing to be a little bit more open then gets ousted by the people who really miss the totalitarian feeling of the group. And then they put someone else in charge or put themselves in charge because they know how to do it right. But I have seen, like, years ago, there was a representative from Hare Krishnas who came to an ICSA conference.
Yes, I was there. I saw them. I was surprised to see someone with a little ponytail, whatever you
Right?
call it, walk around there.
Yeah. Yeah, because there were a lot of reports of abuse and at their schools and at different temples, and they really believed in the teachings, and they really wanted it to be turned around, and they wanted to understand what was cultic about it, and so they were open to it. That's not to say that it's perfectly safe now, but that there was the courage, I think, is it takes a lot of courage to do that, to really look at the mistakes that had been made and the lack of oversight and the permission granted for very bad behavior. So I don't know where the group is now in terms of its health or not. I'm sure there are people who are still being controlled there in a way that makes people upset and makes families nervous. But it can happen. You would just want to watch to see who the leadership is, who has a voice, and if they really care about making sure that there is safety or a greater amount of safety there. But it all really depends on if the person in charge is willing to forfeit total control.
Yeah. It's really close to home for me, this what you just said, because the movement that I was part of for a while, ISTA, they've been attacked, and I mean attacked for all the right reasons. I've spoken about them. I haven't attacked them, but I've haven't held back with my criticism, and there are some very outspoken and active activists out there as well who have done probably a bit more than just publicly criticize them. And then there's also a group that's trying to bring transformative justice into that movement. And they did, almost a year of mediation to change them from within. But then the activists accuse them of being they're helping with ISTA's whitewash. And I'm kind of sitting on the fence. And I find all this really interesting, not just how do we understand the harm that happens in cults, and how do we help people out, and how are they not being mocked and shamed, but get the right support when they come out. But also, what about the groups themselves? What is the right way forward here? If we can't, especially if the abuse or whatever is not on the scale where it's just easy, it's never easy to just shut a cult down anyway. Is it justified, or are there good reasons to keep something going and actually support the ones in the organization who want to do better to do that, instead of blaming, shaming the whole thing, inviting off? I don't know. I'm in 2 months, but I'm watching this really closely. And just to come back to what you asked before about a common thread, another common thread, and probably no surprise to you given all the many groups you've dealt with, is how complicit or ignorant or blind or willful blindness sometimes is from authorities when it comes to groups. And that's true with all the 3 groups in or 4. I mean, I've also went to the Osho meditation resort in Pune and spent a week there. I didn't investigate them, and it was a bit of cult tourism I did there. And again, a very controversial movement that had its clash with authorities. But with Centerpoint and Agama and Gloriavale, I think it's really fair to say too little was done too late. And in some cases, I think it's fair to say with Agama, there are enough rumors that the Swami there is paying off Thai authorities, and that he chose this country really well, where he can actually get away with what he's doing. And with Centrepoint, there was a complicit head of the police back in the days when there were already complaints being made to the police about sexual abuse of children there, and the police officer or sergeant, or whatever it was at the time, actually was very chummy with Brooke Potter and totally handled this in the wrong way. And it actually stopped, it actually stopped an investigation that could have happened at the time. And that's another common thread: too little done too late by people who should actually know better, which brings us back to the cult education, right?
Right. Yes. Too little too late happens quite a lot. Sometimes nothing and too late happens. And yes, there's so many people who are in positions of authority who could be doing so much. They sometimes don't take it on, maybe because they don't feel equipped to, and so they just avoid it rather than leaning in and saying, okay, we might not have regulations yet or laws where we know what to do about this, but we still need to keep watch. We need to make sure the people there are safe while we're figuring out how we approach it and how we respond, right? But that just doesn't happen.
And I think this is, again, where the media plays a real crucial role, and where I can look at my colleagues. Some of them are doing a great job, especially some really good documentaries lately that have come out. Have been a game changer. I think it's fair to say also internationally that there's been some documentaries have really made a difference and are really great and nuanced and survivor focused. But when authorities are not ready yet to step in, this is where the media really makes a difference. Nexium wouldn't have, the FBI investigation to Nexium wouldn't have happened without the front page story in the New York Times. And we see the same here now with Glorivale, where this new documentary that has come out, which is a proper investigative documentary, and it's heart-rending and it's eye-opening. And now there's a more public outcry, and it will put pressure on politicians and on authorities. So I think media has a big role to play to understand that they are actually the ones who can tell the stories that are important to hear, even if those are not always things that someone can go to the police for, right? Like you said before, how do you can't really go to police and say, I've been emotionally, I've been brainwashed, or there's no law against that here, at least not in New Zealand. I think in some place in the world there is that. I'm a bit out of my depth here when it comes to all the legal stuff, but it's hard enough even making a sexual abuse account a complaint. And you said this earlier, where you said this heartbreaking thing that one of your clients said, I wish I had some marks on my body, almost so that people would believe that this was abuse. But the emotional, the spiritual abuse, it's not a crime. It's not something you can go to a lawyer for, and where do you even begin? But for media, for journalists, for good journalists to understand that and hear people's stories and actually tell them in a way that this really comes across, and also to find the commonality with the normal, so quote unquote, normal people out there, where we can, as readers, also understand, hey, actually, that's not so different to how I am, or what I maybe experienced, or what I'm looking for, what I'm seeking, or the community that I move in, or the fervor or enthusiasm I have for something that I'm just learning right now. And if this was taken a little bit further, well, maybe I would end up in the same space. So I want to advocate for building these bridges and stop the us versus them, because that's what cults do, right? The fear and the evil world out there, and we're the superior ones. And you said another thing before, Rachel, which reminded me of a beautiful person in my book, Theo Pratt, Glorivale Lever, who's now the first woman in New Zealand, actually, from Glorivale, with a tertiary education as an occupational therapist, which is amazing. And she will be coming to Decult and speaking. And when she was kicked out at 18 years old, 17 or 18, and they just put her on a bus in pretty much, it's the middle of nowhere, pretty much. And she had to go to Christchurch, where I live, which is a 3-hour bus ride. And then she had a plane ticket to some person in Auckland who she'd, I think, never met before. And she's never been in an airport before. All this was extremely stressful and overwhelming for her already. And she had left and thought she'd never see her family ever again. She'd taken just a few belongings. She even took her headscarf with her, because that was a piece of her old life. She didn't want to get. And then someone at the airport, she didn't know how the what do you call this thing where you put your luggage on, like a trolley or so. She tried some of these trolleys out of maybe with a coin machine or something. She didn't know how this worked. And someone just stepped forward and helped her and said, hey, let me help you. They could probably see that she didn't know how to operate this thing. And this for her was such a pivotal moment. The random kindness of a stranger, when her whole life she had been told, when you're out there in this world out there, no one's going to help you. No one's going to be as loving and caring as we are here in Gloriaville. And then some stranger at the airport just helped her with her luggage there. And wow, it was a game changer for her. So yeah, I just had to think of that earlier when you said something about people suddenly encountering kindness in a place where they never thought this could just happen. And this is what the world out here can be like. It's not perfect. The world out here is not perfect. And it's not like none of these dynamics are not also playing out here. And I've also heard this from cult leaders that once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And then you see these dynamics in other places too. You're highly sensitized, obviously, to being controlled but it does sharpen your senses to some of the bullshit we also buy into. And it's not like we're all perfect because we're not in a cult, and therefore we're not being manipulated at some points too. Right? We all are. It's just it's a scale. It's not just us versus them, and they're all in something and we're not. They're living the extreme form of that, and it's a little beautiful little patriarchy. It's a mini dictatorship. It's an animal farm scenario, and which we can understand, and it could be us too. Maybe not you, Rachel, given the work you've been doing for the last I don't know how many years, but certainly ironically I was that person too while I was researching cults as a journalist. So there you go.
It's a very interesting thing. Yeah, I think also these blanket statements, you always want to be careful about them and suspicious of blanket statements, even though I realize I just made a blanket statement. But still, ironically, there is something so interesting about when people say, oh, the whole world is this, and we are all this, and you can't trust anyone there, but you can trust everyone here. It's like people who, let's say you're starting to date, and you're asking about their past relationships, and they say, oh, all my past girlfriends, boyfriends were all crazy. And you're thinking, maybe not at the beginning of dating you, right? So, and it can't be, but yes, it seems like whatever went wrong was their fault. So I'm out, oh, look at the time. So I think you want to be cautious. But I think, yes, it is true that people are going to have these moments where they get reassured, they have a renewed faith in the fact that the world and people in it can be caring and can take a moment to do something kind in a way that just doesn't happen within a cultic group, at least not with you needing to pay back for it or without it being somehow a trap. I mean, it's never quite safe, if someone does something nice, like what were they up to? And that happens sometimes when people leave cults, that they think people are up to things because they always were before. This time went so quickly. I don't know if I've had a conversation with anyone in the past that has gone this quickly. I'm so sad our time is over. I hope we can talk again, but I want to make sure that you get to announce about the conference if people want to sign up and how they do it and all of the things and where people can find you. So go for it.
Oh, thank you for that opportunity and for all the support. And yeah, so people can find me on Anke Richter, my name, ANKE, and then Richter, like the Richter scale.net, ankerichter.net. And the conference is called Decult, and you can find it on decult.net. And sign up for the newsletter there. It's going to be live stream. Tickets are going live in June. It's a small event with a big impact.
Very nice. And buy Cult Trip. It's a fantastic book. And thank you so much for your work and for all that you put into it, all the heart that you put into it. It comes through. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.
One more thing before you go. What a total pleasure to speak with Anke. It was so nice to be able to talk to someone who I have known, but virtually for so long. It is really lovely to have this conversation, and there were so many parts of it that were powerful. One of the things that Anke mentioned was this through line with different groups, and that two of the things that she mentioned as being pretty consistent through lines was the idea of sexual control, not necessarily repression, but sexual control, how often you could have it and with whom and what kind, etc., and ignorance and the turning of a blind eye by authorities. This is something that happens so often. The turning of a blind eye, this is something that kind of goes back to something I mentioned in last week's episode, just about the bystanders just bystanding. The people there who might not be causing the abuse per se, but aren't doing anything to stop it, aren't doing anything to protect you, aren't doing anything to be outraged or to change the system and to provide you with any level of protection. When we talk about authorities, I also think about all the other people who are involved in cultic groups who are either feigning ignorance or really are kept in the dark, where they're not necessarily turning a blind eye, but they have blinders put on, where they can't protect their loved ones. They can't even really protect themselves, but so many people are kept in the dark. They don't know sometimes what's happening to their husbands and wives or their children, their parents. It's also true that when you talk about authorities, for children involved in cults, the authorities aren't necessarily just the police outside the compound or the school district or teachers who aren't doing anything to protect them, even though they're coming to school looking like something really is wrong. But also the authorities are the parents. And the authorities are also sometimes the older children or the older siblings. Anyone who within society a child could lean on, a child could go to, a child could be protected by. All the people within society, too, who are mandated reporters, the nurses and the doctors and the clergy and all others. And when everyone feigns ignorance or is ignorant or turns a blind eye or has blinders put on, the end result is that you have members who know that there's nothing that will stop perpetrators. There's nothing to protect them from any level of abuse or any sort of abuse. And including when we talk about abuse, neglect, things like malnourishment, endangerment. It is incredibly powerful when people leave cult groups where they find out that there are people who are built into society who care, and whether they care personally or not, they are mandated reporters. They have to report what they see if something seems suspicious, if something seems dangerous, someone seems hurt, someone seems harmed in any way. But there are plenty of people also who will do what they can to protect others, even if they're not mandated reporters, even if they're not under obligation to report it, even if they just notice that something is off and they check in with someone and say, "Everything okay?" Or "You could talk to me if you wanted to or needed to." Sometimes just having one person care, just one person come forward, can make all the difference, where you realize you're not necessarily at the mercy of anyone without anyone knowing. I want to also mention about the sacrifice that Anke made in doing the research, which is true for a lot of people who do cult shows, docuseries, articles, books, go undercover. Some people who have joined cults to see what happens there. I don't recommend it because you can get caught up in it. But these are people who sometimes come out of these experiences with their own traumatic impact. And this is something that Anke talks about, that she got post-traumatic stress from researching this group Centerpoint. Now, if you can get trauma that stays within your system on a cellular level after just researching something, you can only imagine what it's like to be there and what it's like to be living that. So to Anke, to all others, but especially Anke, because she really has thrown her hat in the ring, who really went in, kind of dove into the deep end, into the trenches, to research a group that was so disturbing, just so that she could inform the public about it. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. It is very powerful also when people get involved in things that they care about because their conscience has driven them to care about it. And then they go the extra step to want to do something about it. And so I hope everyone who's listening will look into the conference that she is putting together, the Decult Conference, that she and others who she is connecting with are going to be hosting in New Zealand. There need to be more conferences like this around the world. There need to be resources. And whether or not people who are involved in cults or who have recently left cults can attend these conferences, there's something very empowering and isolation busting when you just know that a conference like that exists. Because if you've been through an experience and you haven't talked to anyone about it and you haven't gotten support and you haven't been able to get help and you don't even quite know if what you went through was so horrible, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but you've learned to kind of put down your experience as not being so bad. Suddenly, if someone you see is speaking about their experience in this group at a cult conference, it helps you know there's a reason that you're having all these after effects, that you might be having nightmares, that you are having a post-traumatic symptom picture. And it helps you know you're not imagining it, and it helps you know that you're not alone. Talk to you next week. Thank you very much for listening. Please support Indoctrination on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @Indoctrination Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.